Welcome to this special webinar hosted by BizClick Media Group in association with GEP, the market-leading provider of software as a service-based procurement and supply chain software. Today, we are going to be discussing how to operationalize supply chain sustainability to achieve net zero emissions. Now, corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and environmental, social and governance, ESG, issues are at the forefront of the minds of corporate leaders everywhere. However, while plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to become net zero emitters may well be in place, achieving them is easier said than done. So, how can enterprises move from goals to real results? What can they do to operationalize and embed sustainability across the supply chain? Well, today we'll discuss the steps to take right now and gain insight on how to create an action plan for reporting on and reducing emissions. My name is Scott Birch, and joining me today are Natalie Henfrey, Director of Consulting at GEP, Raghu Ikambaran, Senior Director of Consulting at GEP, and Ben Godfrey, Vice President, Raw Material and Forming at Rolls-Royce. Natalie has led global supply chain and procurement transformations across multiple sectors and disciplines. She's been an advocate for procurement's positive role in ESG issues since working in the UK public sector for some 20 years, and continues to drive her passion for this work into her projects at GEP. Raghu comes with 15 years of experience in the procurement and supply chain space. He's been a trusted advisor for the procurement or supply chain leadership of several Fortune 100, 500 clients, and his focus areas include large-scale transformation projects. Ben is an expert in procurement, operations, and supply chain. He has bought and managed everything that goes into an airplane engine, even down to the nuts and bolts. He's currently VP of Procurement at Rolls-Royce, where he has managed some of the biggest long-term supplier relationships in the aerospace supply chain, as well as managing multiple crises and improving large operational supply chains. So welcome, Natalie, Raghu, and Ben. Thank you for being with us today. Now we're going to start with some presentation slides, and then we'll be back later on for some Q&A. So Natalie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Hello, everybody. Our agenda has three parts today. First of all, we're going to talk a little about the current status of regulations and reporting standards. Secondly, we'll talk a little about the holistic and scope 3 specific approaches to new environmental standards. And finally, most importantly probably, is how we operationalize supply chain sustainability using the right tools, the right measurements, etc. And throughout all of these, we'll be having a good discussion with Ben and sharing some of our experience with you. So let's start talking about the current status of regulations and reporting standards. Before I move on to the next slide, I would have loved to have mapped out what it looks like for you. It's just too complicated. It's a real massive landscape of regulations. There are guidelines, there are toolkits, there are private and not-for-profit and public organisations all in this space. And to be honest, right now, there are lots of things out there, and you could be forgiven for looking at it all and saying, this is too bewildering. So I'll spare you the map, but I will focus on a few areas just to make you see how difficult this area is right now. In terms of standards and guidelines, there are many, many more than this. These are some of the ones you've probably heard of, and they're in quite common usage. Now, one of the positive things to come out of COP26 was actually moving to more consolidation in the standards and guidelines. So these ones we've marked with the red box, the SASB, the CDSB, TCFD are all merging together to be the ISSB, which is led by IFRS, and there are an awful lot of acronyms there. But basically, from the beginning of 2023, the plan is that there will be a common standard for reporting within the TCFD framework. That makes the landscape a little less confusing for everybody. However, right now, while they go through consultation, it remains as it is. The second set are 4 of the most commonly used goals and policies. Now, we obviously work with a huge range of clients, and everybody is using one of these as the kind of keystone for their responsible sourcing policy. Organisations tend to use just one of them, but if you look at it from a supplier's perspective, they need to be familiar with all of them because their customers will be using different goals and policies in their responsible sourcing communications and supplier code of conducts, etc. This drives a lot more complexity into the supply base. Finally, it's what we've imaginatively called other. There are an awful lot of organisations out there. CDP, Science-Based Targets, SBTI are 2 of the most well-known. EcoVadis is another one. And as I mentioned earlier, these tend to be either businesses or not-for-profit or publicly run organisations. And what they allow you to do is to benchmark and score your ESG performance, and quite often share that with your customers to show how well you're doing. There are certain organisations out there who only deal with suppliers who are hitting a certain level of scores in these kinds of platforms. Just to add to the general complexity though, all of these things are scored and weighted differently. And again, if we think back to your supply base, your suppliers are probably having to use a number of these for their various customers. It drives cost into their business. They have to not only give up time to understand these different platforms, but also manage them, input to them, interpret the results, and then act on a number of different potentially conflicting targets for improvement. Below this, and I wouldn't even start to map this, there is a lot of data out there. Now, Raghu is going to speak on about data later on, but if you're an organisation trying to benchmark yourself and see how well you're doing, or trying to get information on, what you should be doing, the information out there tends to be very national. In fact, sometimes it's very local and it's very specific to particular parts of ESG. So I'm thinking of organisations like the Brazilian Forestry Commission, for example, reporting on deforestation there. It's at that kind of level. There are very few databases out there with information which tell you all about deforestation in South America, for example, which would be a lot more user-friendly. So bearing in mind this bewildering landscape, it would be really great to hear from Ben about what it looks like from a practitioner's point of view. So Ben, what is Rolls-Royce's approach and how did you come up with your current reporting standards? Can you give insight into some aerospace specific examples, perhaps?
Sure, thank you for the question. And I absolutely agree. There is a huge amount of complexity out there. There's a lot of overlap as the slide talks to. I think one of our cornerstones in our decision making is that we will always seek to use and implement globally recognized standards. So greenhouse gas protocol is one that's well known. We will also look to complement that with what we see as good practice from kind of wider international bodies such as the International Aerospace Group. And we've recently published a very detailed report middle of last year, which sort of talks through all of this in great detail and is definitely worth a look. I think we also recognise that we will use publicly available accounting standards. We're not going to look to reinvent the wheel here, and we do indeed work with those frameworks that you've alluded to there. So the UN Development Goals is one that's close to us. We are in the process of setting science-based targets, and we will start there with a coverage metric, absolutely, and we'll complement that with an absolute reduction metric because we're very conscious that it's important to take action early to drive the abatement curve, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little more detail later. The second half of your question was more about some sort of aerospace kind of manufacturing, I guess, complexity that we deal with, and there's a whole range of specific kind of regulations and rules that our industry operates within, which I'm sure many will either have similar, the same, or can see some of the parallels. So to touch on some of those, for example, we are very closely controlled on the usage of conflict minerals, and have some fairly stringent reporting requirements, which is, again, to your point, not exactly the same in which jurisdiction you're working in. So some similarities but differences in the EU and the UK as an example. We, like many, clearly feel that modern slavery is something that's important, but indeed we have an obligation to identify, kind of report, and mitigate in that area. We have long had to work within REACH regulations. For those not so familiar, they are control of hazardous chemicals, which has sort of year on year got more stringent, and we need to understand and start to remove the use of some of those hazardous chemicals. And there are similar acts in the US that we need to work with.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. And when you look at the upcoming changes, including ISSB consolidation, are there any specifics you would comment on, and does this change your approach?
Yeah, I think first of all, what I do is sort of venture my personal opinion, and that's a reflection of the point that there's a lot of complexity embedded in the picture today, and there's a lot of moving pieces out there, whether that's regulation or whether that's customer expectation. So some of this is about a judgment call, as well as being able to establish the fact base. So I think, touching on some of the themes I just mentioned, I think you will see continued further restrictions on hazardous substances. Some of the extraction of metals that goes on around the world that we need for electrification and battery technology, they don't happen in kind of very nice conditions. They don't happen with very nice chemical processes. So I think we'll continue to see that. I think we'll see further restrictions and tightening up on reporting of greenhouse gases. You can see some moves in the EU that's heading that way, very much so. I think you will also see, perhaps a different import and export kind of regulation and playing field that will drive some of this discussion. So I point to our recent experiences of import taxes on plastics into the UK, not necessarily financially punitive, but drive you to a point of understanding that complexity deep in your supply chain that's beyond perhaps where we've been in the past, to drive a performance and behavior change. Outside of that, I think customers will increasingly prioritize this topic in their choices. We are starting to see, indeed, EASA have created an eco label, so similar to you might see on a house or a washing machine. Bombardier have put that into one of their regional jets. So we're starting to see that sort of consumer pressure and response from producers in a different way. I think that's one. You mentioned ISSB consolidation. I don't think that necessarily changes our approach. It's something we've been reviewing and tracking for a period of time. But what we do note is the increasing attention and scrutiny from financial investors and financial regulators relating to, the claims and the status of these topics within companies. On balance, we see that as a positive. Anything that can continue to shine a light and draw investment into those businesses that can provide solutions to this broader topic, we see as positive. And we actually see Rolls-Royce's technology in the medium to long term as a key contributor in that space.
Great, thank you very much for those insights, Ben. Now let's move on and talk about Scope 3 emissions, and Raghu, over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. All right, so the next few minutes we are going to be talking about the holistic emissions and Scope 3 in particular. But just to give you some background over here, and if we can just move on to the next slide, right? The Paris Agreement back from 2015 called for governments and organizations to restrict the average global temperature increase to within 1.5 degrees of above pre-industrial levels, right? The possibility of us hitting that target by 2025 was almost zero when we go back to 2015. However, in 2021, IMF is reporting that we had an average temperature increase of about 1.1 degrees centigrade, and they also estimate that there is a 50% probability that we'd be able to hit this 1.5 degree increase by 2026. These are alarming, right? And even some reports suggesting that we could probably hit an increase of about 4.1 degrees by 2100, which would be significant impact to about 10% of the world's population that are living in coastlines, we're going to be talking about biodiversity changes. We are going to be talking about, increase in temperatures across the globe and all of these things. So it's high time that, we fortify our actions around emissions management, with it being the chief contributor, to the global warming. So considering that, we have people with a wide variety of emissions related experience in our audience today, what we'd like to do is we'd like to provide a quick overview of the different types of emissions before we talk about, how do we start to control, right? So there are three different types of emissions. If you look at, what we have over here, the scope 1 emissions cover, the direct emissions that are, from owned or controlled entities for an organization. The scope 2 covers indirect emissions, let's say from generation of purchased electricity, heat, cooling, all of those things. And scope 3 covers all of the other indirect emissions that might occur within the company's entire value chain, both upstream and downstream, including all the way, to the product's end use, the end of life of the product, and how it's been recycled and reused, right? Now, specifically, if you start looking at scope 3, you'll see that there are about 15 different categories between, the upstream and the downstream. And that just talks about how complex it is, to look at scope 3, have a baselining of the scope 3 and look at how do we report and govern it, right? So again, going back, to some data, about 71% of the companies across the globe report scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, but only less than 10% of the organizations are actively looking at managing their overall scope 3 portfolio, right? Whereas about 30 to 40% of the organizations are looking at managing a partial portfolio. And the remaining are just waking up to or still ignorant of their scope 3 numbers. And this is all because of the complexity that we have, when it comes to the scope 3 emissions over here. So why is scope 3 important? Again, if we start looking at, what we said earlier, we are probably at about 50% probability of hitting that 1.5 degree increase by 2026. And, if you'll have to control this and if you'll have to still, be within the, 2 degree target that we have set for ourselves, we need to increase our carbon intensity emission reduction by about 5 to 6 times as what it is today. 2020, I think, we reported a number of about 2.5% reduction in carbon emission intensity. And that needs to grow all the way to about 13%, over the next few years, just so that we'd still be able to remain within the 2% number. And, to achieve these kind of reductions, it's going to be impossible for us, by just controlling the scope 1 and scope 2. There needs to be a larger call to action when it comes to scope 3 emission reductions, right? And, that is the reason why we're going to be talking, more about how do we control, scope 3 emissions. But before we move forward and talk about controlling, Ben, a question to you would be, what's Rolls-Royce perspective when it comes to scope 3? How much do you have visibility into, and what kind of governance do you have around it?
I think the first thing I'd say is that can't be one of our modern jet engines with the plume of smoke out the back of it. We are particularly proud of the clean technology and the fuel efficiency that we deploy. But of course, we do track scope 3 emissions. We've made commitments on the topic, and therefore we need to track it. And by far and away, the biggest contributor for us is the use of our product. These things run, kind of week in, week out for 20 to 30 years. So that's by far and away the biggest contributor. And we're really proud of the work we're doing on sustainable aviation fuel and other things to, kind of drive performance improvements there. After that, the next biggest contributor by some distance is the, kind of manufacturer and supply chain. And then quite a distant third is our own manufacturing operations. So if you can imagine, material coming out of the ground through mining processes all the way through alloy, casting, forging, machining, all of those processes are, fairly energy and, carbon intensive. And all of that contributes to kind of our footprint. And we see we have a big responsibility as part of our supply chain and part of our purpose to address that and to support and collaborate through the value stream in any way that we can. We've been really pleased with some of the work we've done in our own operations. We've been able to decarbonize some of our footprints recently, using some of our technology as well, actually. And we're also really proud of some of the work we've done in circularity, so recycling and reverting of material, which in itself takes out the need to mine and melt and forge a number of those materials. And actually what we're doing there is sharing that quite openly with our suppliers, and the hope that some of that good practice can actually contribute to their and our needs and aspirations to improve here. We currently, like many, we're using a largely spend-based methodology. That's in some part a reference to the complexity of a big supply chain, if you can imagine what feeds engine build and the complexity and the number of parts there. So we use a spend methodology. Increasingly, we are moving to some mass-based calculations. We have those baseline, and we have plans that we are tracking against. We track somewhere in the order of 20 plus line items underneath that. So group those into sort of raw materials, products, services, capital goods, all of which have a contributor and all of which have a plan to drive improvements.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of interesting points that you're bringing out there. And one is just to talk about the complexity across the supply chain when it comes to tracking these Scope 3 emissions. And a company like Rolls-Royce, if they're able to manage to do that, right, across the 15 different Scope 3 line items that we have over here, I think that's wonderful. And that I should believe will give confidence to a lot of our viewers today that they'd also be able to take up the activity of Scope 3 baseline. And the second thing that you also talked about is how do we control this? You spoke about circularity, you spoke about supplier engagements. I think that kind of segues really nicely into the next topic that we are going to be discussing today, which is about how do we control Scope 3 emissions. So if you can just move on, and Natalie, if you can just get us started over there, I think that'll be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move to the next slide. We'll walk you through. We came up with a 5-step plan of how you operationalize sustainability. And this is always a challenge for a lot of people we speak to, because you've got this lovely glossy, maybe not brochure, but lovely glossy corporate sustainability strategy. But the reality of running a supply chain is that it's a complex, dirty thing. And trying to close the gap between the two things is very, very challenging. So we think there are 5 key steps to take. First of all, education. So understand what emissions are classified as Scope 3 and the different categories that fall under this scope, and also then identify what is most applicable to your business. Look at how other people report this, and look at customer expectations in your industry, local legislation, etc. Use that information to assess your current state and find out what needs to be done, and also consider cross-sector collaboration to pool your resources to report. However, the most important thing in education is to think about how your team uses that information, because this isn't just something which a chief supply chain officer should be worrying about. It actually should eventually be embedded in every single member of your team. So every time they make a supply chain decision, they're not just thinking about the financial cost, they're thinking about the environmental cost as well. And over time, they should start to understand the trade-off between those two things before they make that decision. Secondly, preparation. Organisations that are doing this well have set up cross-functional teams to take ownership of this. So it ceases to become a supply chain issue, and it's an organisation-wide issue. They also understand that there are different conversations to have with the various stakeholders in their business. The conversation that you'll have with the CFO, for example, is going to be very different to the conversation with the head of operations or head of manufacturing. Your cross-functional team should baseline your current Scope 3 emissions, and then start looking at leveraging automated reporting software and tools so you can enable faster data collection and processing. Now, Raghu, why don't you take us through the last 3 steps?
Sure. I think you touched upon a couple of very important and interesting aspects over there. I'd like to talk more about baselining right now. When you did talk about some of the methodologies that you used, on the baselining side, be it the spend-based methodology, be it the mass-based methodology, or the supplier-specific methodology, in that order of increasing accuracy. But what is important over there, again, is the complexity around how do we go about baselining all of these things, right? So we are talking about, just purchase goods and services where there are going to be, let's say, hundreds of categories where you need to baseline, using either a spend-based methodology or a mass-based methodology. And that is just going to keep increasing, with you adding, let's say, capital goods, employee transport, and any of the downstream activities. So what needs to happen is, the baseline needs to be accurate for you to then get into our next step, which is, reporting and engagement, right? So once, the baselining is complete, what the baselining will help you do is it'll help you understand what the hotspots are when it comes to, your emissions. The hotspots can be classified either based on categories that you're working, on suppliers that are emitting the most, on plants that are emitting the most. Again, the classification is going to be, very different across the different organizations that we're going to be looking at, because some might want to do it at a plant level because that's where the capex is locked. Some might want to do it across the plants at a supplier level, and so it's going to be very specific to the different organizations that we're going to be talking about. Once this is done, right, then what typically happens is, based on the hotspots that we've identified, we need to start putting together a very elaborate supplier engagement plan. Now, the supplier engagement plan needs to include elements such as communication. What are the rules of engagement? How are we going to engage the suppliers? What's the frequency of engagement? What are the kind of reporting, that we're going to be talking about? Are you going to ask the suppliers to report out, quarterly? And what metrics are you going to be asking the suppliers to report out on? Now, again, there could be multiple metrics, like, as simple as just saying that, oh, okay, we just need your EcoVadis score. Or it can be as complicated as, we'd like to understand your CDP, we'd like to understand your energy consumption, all of those things, so that, we have a complete and an elaborate picture as to what, the suppliers' emissions are going to look like, right? And, all of this will then eventually talk about how do we then go ahead with, identifying the hotspots and creating, those specific areas for us. Once we are done with this, once, we have a pilot in place and, we understand that this is working, then typically, we get into the next phase, which is, the expansion phase over here, where we are going to be including not just our hotspot suppliers or hotspot categories, but, go outside, include all the non-hotspot, expand to all the plans, expand to, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, because we are eventually talking about the entire value chain. We're just not talking about the tier 1 suppliers over here. And that, I think, is where, the complications are going to be, multifold over here. Finally, the more important part is, it is good to understand all the complications, all the areas of improvement. But eventually, if you don't have a target, it's going to be very difficult for us to work towards and measure us against where we are committed towards. And so the reporting and the target setting is going to be based on the appetite of the company again, because meeting carbon reductions is also going to entail significant capex investments in order to support any of the projects that are going to be required from a carbon reduction point of view, or it could be entailing significant OPEX expenditures, which include buying carbon credits, right? And therefore it's going to be very company specific, and you'll have to work with the CFO, the CEO, to try and figure out how much a company would be able to commit to at any given point in time. What is also going to be important is for you to run these targets by entities like CDP, SBTi, because what this also does is it gives you two things. One, it ensures that you don't operate in a silo, and two, it'll get an external auditor's point of view as to how you are measuring and reporting your emissions, and that will give us more confidence that we are progressing on the right track. So this is, again, it's a simple call out when it comes to how do we operationalize, but only a practitioner might be able to talk to us about what's the process that's been followed and the complications that surround operationalizing your scope 3 emission reductions. So Ben, I'm just going to pass this ball back to you, and the question is, how did you do this at Rolls-Royce, and what are the challenges that you faced when it comes to operationalizing scope 3 emission reductions?
Well, thank you. I think it's fair to say we don't see this as a destination. It's an ongoing thing. Certainly, I'll start with kind of providing a bit of a personal insight, because I think you have to, as an individual, have your reason why, and everybody will. I think important to note. My reason why actually came from an insight, kind of, again, you have to bear with me while I digress ever so slightly, but I was kind of watching a David Attenborough documentary with my son, got to talking about it with a colleague the next day, and kind of had an insight that said, this is actually more important to me than perhaps I've realized. And actually I need to move myself into a mindset of I can actually do a hell of a lot about this personally and from the position I am within the company that I operate in. So that insight and that reason why is the place where I would start. I think from that, we did a huge amount of engaging with our wider stakeholders, some of our sustainability professionals, but we also looked outside the organization. We've spent and are spending and are very open to the dialogue on an ongoing basis, a lot of time talking with peers, people in similar industries, people in very different industries, our suppliers, some of our customers, looking to glean that best practice, looking to understand and try and sort of navigate through the landscape that we've spent some time talking about here. We've also proactively engaged with and taken self-help from trade organizations and bodies. So one example there is I'm actually leading an RFQ process with IAEG, the International Aerospace Environmental Group. And we're looking to tackle that very problem Natalie described, that says, even within aerospace, the Rolls-Royce and its peers, very easily could all set out very different standards and expectations for our suppliers to follow. We're not going to do that. So through that work with IAG, we're absolutely looking to come up with one set of voluntary standards and kind of rules of operation here. That's not easy. That internalizes a lot of this conversation, but it forces us to go through the thought processes and the mechanism we're talking about here. We are engaged and working with EcoVadis, who were mentioned on the call, and we're really pleased to be doing that. We think they give us a really good baseline and a breadth of baseline across our supply chain on the wider ESG topic. We've spent a lot of time within procurement actually defining our policy position here, in the process of then hardwiring that policy through our decision making, our metrics, the incentives with the team, our contracts, our scorecards, a whole list of how we do business. So we're in the process of doing that. That sounds quite formulaic, and it brings me back to the culture point that actually this is a change program. We've got a huge amount of people in our business that want to be part of this, and tapping into them has been hugely important. So the topic that we're talking about is reviewed on a monthly basis by our Chief Operating Officer, and we have a wide forum there that is an open forum for many to contribute and talk about ideas. So much so that we are running some events in the coming months where kind of there's a no idea is a bad idea, kind of Dragon's Den style. Let's get it all onto that. That's a huge engagement piece for our kind of internal teams, and we're doing something very similar with our suppliers. So we run what we call a high performance supplier group. So those suppliers that consistently deliver high performance to us across all of our metrics, we engage with in a closer manner, and we are actively talking with them and learning from them in many instances, how to do this, and sharing good practices that we're having, as well as listening intently to those that are kind of on this journey and making those improvements. I think you asked me about challenges. So I come back to the point you've made a couple of times. So data visibility in a kind of complex, Natalie said, maybe she said dirty, I would have said messy supply chain. I think that data visibility is absolutely key. We are talking to small startups, half a dozen people that are focused on a very specific part of this question. We're also talking to some of the biggest sort of household names that are out there from a digital perspective, all about this topic and how we might collaborate and support each other. As part of that, we have our own recently launched business unit, which we call R2 Factory, and they are launching what they call a residency, hopefully quarter 3-4 this year, exactly to take that topic of data visibility and what they can do from a digital and artificial intelligence perspective to support businesses. So we're very actively sort of guiding on that thought process, albeit it's a challenge. I think the other topic then was also mentioned by Natalie, which is this means different things to different people, to the CFO, to the CPO, supply chain officer. And I made the point to each individual, and it's really important that we think about it in that way. and we think about how we want to operationalize with suppliers. As I've alluded to, we've got some suppliers that are hugely enlightened and enabled on this journey. Perhaps even has we are learning a lot from those guys, and we've got some others that are perhaps still in a thought process that this is a cost to their business rather than an opportunity to generate value. And for us, that is one of the key challenges, to win that hearts and mind battle with those guys, so we can all deliver on our commitments.
Awesome. I think thank you for touching upon all of these complexities, and what we'd like to do is, as part of the next few minutes, we also want to talk about the complexity that you mentioned around data visibility, and how we'd be able to overcome not completely, but at least to a large extent, how we'd be able to overcome data visibility issues, and how we'd be able to ensure that management has the right line of sight into where we are progressing, how we are progressing, and what are the key hotspots, right? But even before we go over there, just want to call out a few things. I think though it's a norm now, right? In a few years, investors are going to be attaching values to carbon emissions. You were talking about how most people see all of these investments as a cost rather than as a value generator at this point in time. But eventually, investors are going to be attaching a value to the carbon emissions, both the direct carbon emissions and indirect carbon emissions of a company, when they're going to be making these investment choices. I read an IMF report that pegs a value of 1 ton of carbon emission at roughly about $75. This is including the social costs of the carbon emissions, right? And just talking about the amount of emissions that each of these organizations have, that is going to be a significant value that the investors are going to be placing on on the emissions, and therefore controlling the emissions is going to be very, very important. What is also a new trend that we are seeing is that insurance companies are also not willing to cover their clients who might not have an elaborate ESG plan in place, because it believes that they put their clients at risk, right? So I mean, we've spoken about all of the complexities when it comes to scope 3 emissions, and we've spoken about reporting related activities. Just one call out over here again. So if we look at the 2021 CDP supply chain report, they talk about some of the best-in-class companies reporting their scope 3 emissions on a monthly basis, with an average time that they spend on reporting to be less than 5 days, right? And we have some companies on the other end of the spectrum that don't even report their scope 3, and that find it very complicated. So how do we move from one end of the spectrum, which is companies not reporting or companies finding it difficult to report, to the other end of the spectrum, where companies are going to be looking at an easy methodology to report? And I think all of this is going to be supported by some of the technology advancements that we have when it comes to reporting and baselining. There are quite a few services and tools that are available in the market, with GP's homegrown tool being one among them, right? So given, again, I'm going back to how these emissions are calculated, particularly when it comes to purchase goods and services, and let's say capital goods. It can either be based on, let's say, your spend, your mass, or your volumes, and finally your suppliers. Given that we manage our spend data for a large clientele of ours, and we have all of this, be it your spend information, be it your volume information, or supplier information as part of the spend data, it becomes easy for us to overlay our emissions module on top of the existing spend module, which help our clients with increasing the pace and accuracy of reporting, right? So if you look at what we have over here, our dashboards, again, there are typically 3 broad sections of the dashboards. One being the emissions numbers that have been reported, along with the scope 3 spend that we are looking at. The second part of the dashboard, if we can just keep moving our slides, is talking about what our targets are, what is the progress that we are making, and what's the gap to target. And the last set of slides will talk about identification of the hotspots, based on either your plant, your supplier, or as we move to the next slide, you'll be able to look at it from what are the hotspots from a category point of view, right? All of these can be managed easily on a monthly basis, because your spend data gets updated on a monthly basis. And these will give the companies the necessary data visibility that is needed to manage their emissions better. So with that, I think these are the broad areas that we wanted to cover when it comes to how do we operationalize, how do we not just look to operationalize, but also how do we improve efficiencies when it comes to reporting and management. Scott, we'd pass it back to you to see if there are any questions or comments.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. We have had some questions come in from our audience today, so thank you very much for sending those in, everybody. Now, just to begin with, we do have a few minutes where we can take some questions. So I'm going to turn back to Natalie first, actually. Natalie, why is scope, why is scope 3 becoming such an area of focus?
I think it's got moved up people's agenda a little bit recently because of the SEC's proposal to have reporting on scope 3 in supply chains, and people have realised that it's having to move from a place where it's a very complex thing, where it was a very nice to have, into something which they're really going to have to start reporting on.
Yeah, absolutely. And Raghu, you touched on this in a few of your slides as well. Why should companies prioritize scope 3 to achieve net zero?
I mean, scope 3, roughly forms about 70 to 90% of a company's overall emissions. And, as long as we are looking to hit the, 1.5 or 2 degree targets that we are working towards, and, considering the fact that, we might need 5 to 6x the amount of work that we are doing today, unless and until we touch upon scope 3, it's going to be very difficult for companies to hit, net zero emissions. So, it's going to be a very important topic for everybody to consider.
Absolutely. And Ben, turning finally to you, actually, as representing a company that's been through this as well, how would you suggest companies should get started when it comes to operationalizing sustainability?
We touched on a number of those topics, I guess, in the sort of recent piece there, but I think it is about taking a conscious decision to look at your business, your value stream, sort of the supply chain into you and the customer stream thereafter, and sitting with something that looks like the framework Natalie put up and said, where are we? Where do we play? Where do we feel we need to be? I think it's it's as simple as that, and then having identifying the right people, the right champions, the right stakeholders in your business to then determine your journey from that position.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that, Ben. That's all we've got time for today. I'd really like to say a special thank you to our speakers, Natalie, Raghu, and Ben, and of course you for attending this webinar today. I hope you gained some useful insights into supply chain sustainability. The webinar will also be available to view on demand as well, so please do share the link with any colleagues that you feel may benefit from this. This has been a BizClick Media Group production, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you for watching.